wanted to ask and take a sense from these three chief of critical care in their own domains, that how are they handling all this, and then what is their message for our people, that when we are handling now our patient load at ICU at home is increasing, what should we do? What should be the message for our staff? So that's the context setting. Let me first introduce Dr. Ansari. Dr. Ansari is a dear friend from Mumbai. He's from GR Medical College, Gwalior, and then he did his PG, and all my three panelists are anesthetists today. He did his PG from Jabalpur. Then he was for a long time working with Lilavati, Mumbai, and presently is the Director Critical Care for Nanavati Hospitals, I think for the last 3 years now. And I personally know him as a very warm person and a very good orator. So welcome, Dr. Ansari. Uh, I also have with me from Delhi NCR, Dr. Saurabh Anand. He is the Chief of Neuroanesthesia and Neurocritical Care in Artemis Hospital. He's qualified from Udaipur and then Medical College Udaipur and then SMS Jaipur, again trained in anesthesia, and has worked in neuroanesthesia and neurocritical care as a pioneer in the country, is also part of the Neurocritical Care Association of India. I also have again a very dear friend, Dr. Panda from Kolkata. He is the chief of intensive care in Woodlands Hospital. Again, trained in West Bengal, but he also trained at Sir Gangaram Hospital, where he did his PNB and his specialization in intensive care also. So welcome, Dr. Panda. Welcome, Dr. Saurabh Anand. The flow of the conversation would be that I have already circulated a few questions over the chat also, which I'll be putting that question to one of you individually first, and then I'll ask the other people to pitch into the same question. We'll try to go through these questions first so that most of the things are covered. And by the time when we have more questions, we'll take up from our viewers also and from our family also. I would request everybody to please go on mute, no videos. That creates disturbance, please. We have 63 people, and Kanika, please confirm that, yeah, we have gone live. Okay. We have gone live on FB also. So welcome panel. My first question to Dr. Ansari is, sir, that while you are treating patients today, your ICUs are full, and I know COVID has brought an unprecedented situation for us. When is that you start suspecting that this patient might be a COVID positive patient?
So thank you, Gaurav. First of all, it is a wonderful platform to be here with all my esteemed co-panelists. I think this is the need of the hour. We need to think and talk about it. So I think we are thinking, eating, sleeping COVID nowadays. And I think in the middle of this storm, we need to really ask ourselves a few questions and try to find out the answer collectively. I agree that today there is a paranoia where every person who is walking in a hospital is actually thought to be either an asymptomatic carrier or actually a symptomatic one, which may be mild, moderate, or severely symptomatic. So from the beginning, maybe a month back, when we were very choosy about patients having all the criteria, epidemiological criteria, clinical criteria, and then microbiological criteria all fitting together, and then calling him a proven or a high suspect COVID, we have moved to a place where every person has to prove his innocence. Even a healthcare worker walking in to a patient who has come with maybe a simple acute exacerbation of COPD, to even a neurosurgical patient, we are looking at everyone as a potential suspect. And I think this is very important. Probably this is one of the reasons why India, despite having such a heterogeneous population, has been able to, hold on to the real brunt of COVID-19 as compared to the West. So coming to the point, I think revised MCGM guidelines, because I stay in Maharashtra, so I'll talk about the local guidelines, and it is very important. Guidelines are subject of both the state and the center, so you must follow the state guidelines where you are practicing, and you should be adept with that. I think it's very clear that any person who presents with severe acute respiratory illness, straightforward, is a high risk candidate for a suspect for COVID. But apart from that, any close contact of a suspected or a proven COVID will also come in the ambit of testing, and there are revised guidelines for testing. So asymptomatic COVID suspects usually don't need to be tested. because of the paucity of the testing kits. They need to be home quarantined and closely watched, self-monitoring. But those symptomatic close, kind of contacts, they definitely need to be monitored and tested, preferably if they are staying in a multi-storied building with a home sample collection. If they are staying in slums or areas where there is a population density very high, they should be institutionalized even if they are asymptomatic. If they are symptomatic, high risk, and having multiple comorbidities, pregnancy more than 32 weeks, all these high risk population must be tested even though they may be asymptomatic. So basically there is a matrix by which you have to look at a suspect COVID-19 patient and to decide whether he should be just quarantined or should be actively traced with a nasopharyngeal swab and then appropriately treated. So this is something which I will start with. My other panelists can take it from here.
Yes, Dr. Arvind, please add to it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, sir, Dr. Ansari has put it, I think each thing on the perspective. I just wanted to add, being looking at a neuro ICU, this COVID is actually a prothrombotic state. And we are looking at stroke patients which are coming from the community. And when the stroke patients coming in, we should go for a chest CT along with the head CT, which we are anyway doing it at the same time. So if there is any suspicion in the chest CT, apart if the patient might be asymptomatic, because right now the patients are presenting with complications of COVID as well. So from the community. So as Dr. Ansari has put it forward, that we should have a high index of suspicion. That is the only thing which we can, which is going to save us. And that's what we are doing in stroke patients. At least every stroke patient get a chest CT done, any suspicion, shift him to COVID ICU, and then get a testing done.
Dr. Panda, you'd like to add to this?
See, when we started almost 1.5 months back, initially the guidelines for testing whom we should test, which came from ICMR. As the pandemic progressed, ICMR has done some relaxations in those indications for testing or whom we should test. And now they have included almost everyone. Whosoever you feel like testing, you can go ahead and do a test. So earlier we used to look at the travel history, the contact history, and those respiratory signs and symptoms, the history of fever, sore throat, dry cough, shortness of breath. But now you just only have to have a high index of suspicion. Whomsoever you need to test, you feel like going ahead and do a test, you should go and do a test. Because we are at this point of time, we are worried about the asymptomatic carriers in the society.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. So my question to Dr. Ansari in continuation of this only is, how do you prepare the family for testing? Because life changes. Once a person is tested COVID, everybody becomes an untouchable. The society behaves differently. The patient goes into isolation. So how do you counsel the family in that case?
So believe me, this is the most difficult task. But let me put it this way, I am very lucky. I am working in a tertiary care center where we have a lot of support staff, especially the admin people are helping us, the accident and emergency team, and the flu clinic. So most of the time, whenever the patient is coming to us, either it is coming via a kind of suspect mode, where he comes to the accident and emergency. We have, by the way, created 2 accident and emergencies. We have actually bifurcated our hospital into 2 parts, a red and a green zone. So the green zone will only take those patients who are very clean to have none of the respiratory symptoms. And even there, we have a high index of suspicion. But in a red A&E, all those people with respiratory symptoms, flu clinic referrals, or people who have proven COVID outside, they would be coming. So it becomes very easier to have a reverse contact tracing. All the family members, the building and everything, the epidemiological cell and Ministry of Health and Family Welfare officials are so active that they will take the information from you and go back. So we are not directly talking to them unless the immediate relative who comes along, where it becomes our imperative responsibility to tell them that please ensure that you are home quarantined and you are getting yourself tested. If you are more than 60, you have multiple comorbidities, and if there is a pregnant female inside, distance yourself. And if you have an individual washrooms, use that. So we definitely put it across, but it is now becoming so clear that the epidemiological cell and the ministry officials and other people are pitching into it. So I directly don't need to tell, but whenever given a chance, I do emphasize this on all communications. Thank you.
Gaurav, you need to unmute your mic.
Yeah. So I said, anybody wants to add to it, Dr. Anand or Dr. Panda, if you want to add to that, is family counseling really challenging when you're
See, I will say the awareness right now is huge among us, I will say. And right now we are not facing huge task of counseling the patient and patient attendants right now. But the thing is, everybody knows about it, that it's not only about their patient's health, it's about their family's health and about the community health as well. It's
Hmm.
not about a single person anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. So most of the time, as Dr. Ansari is saying, that we also have a hospital in hospital kind of a thing. So COVID, there is a separate path, separate lift going to a COVID area, and persons who are working in COVID are not actually being in touch with the non-COVID hospital. So it's a hospital and hospital kind of thing. And right now, these team which are actually managing the COVID at that point of time is going to take up the counseling, and most of the time it is being done. I don't think it is actually being facing. We are not facing any problem in doing the testing at our institute.
Great to know that, sir. And if I would ask you only, that what is the testing protocol when you have already now you have the suspicion, you know that this patient I want to test. What is the testing protocol?
See, Dr. Ansari has already told whom to test. Dr. Panda has already put a light on it. I have already added on it. So we know that which subsets to test. Okay. Now, every acute respiratory illness needs to go for a test, and so on and so forth. But how to test is that two swabs, nasal pharynx. See, the yield is maximum with bronchoalveolar lavage, but we are not doing it because it's an aerosol generating procedure and going to carry high risk for the healthcare workers. So most of the time, the two swabs have been taken, a nasal and the pharyngeal swabs, and that has been sent to the designated lab. The government has appointed particular labs in each and every area, that has been taken in a viral represent kits, and that has been transferred to that lab. And in general, in our institute, we are getting the result within 24 hours. So there are a sample collection time. They are coming and taking all those samples, and we have our staffs has been trained and trained and trained like hell for collecting those samples, and we are providing them the PP kits to do that, and presently it's been seamless now.
And what do you do in case a patient tests positive?
So see, you need to act at the emergency ER level. When it's not like what will happen if the patient's test is going to come positive.
Hmm.
Most of the time the test is going to come positive in our institute when the patient is already in the COVID area. Okay, so right now we are fortunate enough that most of the tests which we are sending are coming out negative, and they are again being transferred to non-COVID area. So the most important thing that you need to act at the ER. Otherwise, if you are acting in the ICU, it's too late. It's too late. Your whole hospital staff will be quarantined, and as Dr. Ansari has pointed out, in Mumbai, a couple of hospitals have already been on the verge of closing, and some of them have been closed as well. So you need to act at the level of your first contact, that is your ER, and from there should be a separate path, separate for the isolation of those suspected COVID, I would say. And once the COVID comes in and chips in that the test is going to be positive, the RT-PCR is positive, then the management actually starts from suspected COVID only. But yes, to continue that management, to continue that patient, and to see the progression, which actually going to start from the suspicion itself.
So what I have understood is that the standard precautions of handling any patient do not change before the test also and after the test also. You have to treat every patient as if that patient can be COVID positive, irrespective whether we are doing the testing or not.
See, one more thing I want to add is that your ER is the most important, your first line barrier. How efficient your ER is going to prevent each and everything in your hospital. So your ER should be ready with the PP kits. Our emergency is with the PP kits. Everybody from GDA, from the security guard who is standing outside, okay, everybody is in PPE kit in emergency. From there is a separate path which has been created, and different peoples are wearing different sort of personal protective equipment. So your mask and your hand hygiene, mask etiquette and your hand hygiene is going to prevent your hospital and your patient as well.
Right, sir. Very rightly said. Does Dr. Ansari or Dr. Panda want to add to it?
I'd just like to get back to your previous question because I'd like to highlight certain points that I'm facing here in Calcutta and Bengal as a whole. Uh, the process of sending samples and getting them tested and then getting back the report is a very, very long driven process for us here in Calcutta and Bengal as a whole. Maybe you might be aware of the fact that we are not testing that much of samples as compared to other parts of the country. So this is one very important point because even if I want to send a test, I have to share the detailed history and the clinical findings with state authorities, and they will judge from their side whether I'll actually need to send the sample. Then they have earmarked certain laboratories. I have to send the samples there, and they are not going to share the report to us. They are going to give it back to the state authorities, and only from the state authorities we are getting back the report. So it's a very long driven process for us here in Bengal and Calcutta particular. So this is one very important point for us. This is a problem that we are facing here in Kolkata.
Well, that was quite peculiar to your state itself, because I have not
Yeah,
heard this
absolutely,
in
absolutely, and
Bangalore.
it's unnecessarily taking a lot of time for us, and we are waiting for the reports to come. And till that point of time, till the reports are available to us, we have to maintain that kind of vigil. We have to maintain that kind of protection whenever we are there with the patient, because we still don't know whether the report is going to come as positive or negative. So we have to be alert always. So we are using PPE till the time we are getting the reports. So that is one point that we are. So that is one problem that we are facing here in Bengal and Calcutta particularly.
So, Dr. Panda, Dr. Ansari and Dr. Anand told us very clearly that they are functioning as a hospital in the hospital with all barrier precautions and red zone, green zones. So there is a clarity that the mixing of COVID and non-COVID patients is not happening, because that is one fear which our people have when they're onboarding cases from the hospital, that what if the patient which I am onboarding is a COVID positive patient. Or for example, recently we had a patient who was demented and had some few more problems, but when our nurse refused to go into the hospital, although it was a green zone, still fearing that there might be somebody who's prone to infection, whereas you people day in and day out are living out of those hospitals. So what is special being done in your hospital that COVID and non-COVID do not get mixed?
Just like Dr. Anand has said, the emergency is the most important because that is the first point of contact with the patient. So we are doing our triaging there, and whenever we have that high index of suspicion, we are putting those patients in a special area, that is the isolation ward in in our hospital. That is in one part of the hospital, so we are not mixing patients. So there we have divided into the yellow zone and the red zone. So red zones are those patients who have tested positive. Yellow zone are those patients who are suspected patients. We're keeping them together and we are waiting for the test reports. And once the test reports are coming as negative, we are immediately shifting those patients from the yellow zone to the normal area. And otherwise, if tested positive, we are shifting from the yellow zone to the red zone. So in that way, we are not mixing up patients in our hospital.
Great to know, sir. And let me tell everybody that at this time we have more than 100 people continuously viewing us on Facebook, around 68 on Zoom, and our reach has gone above 3,000 people. So whatever we are speaking is already reached more than 3,000 people. My next question is to Dr. Panda itself, and again, maybe to the other panelists also. Sir, how do you motivate your team?
So that's a very, very essential part because these days there are so much of information going around, and some of them are absolutely trash, misinformation, and there are a lot of rumors also going around in the society. And that particular point that you raised, that there is a kind of stigma around this particular disease, that if COVID comes as positive, then there is a stigma. People are getting marginalized within the society, the family, friends, relatives, contacts. So now everybody is aware that if there is a positive case, then the contacts are going to get quarantined. So there is a lot of stigma that is revolving around this disease. So keeping my team motivated is hell of a task. So what we do is in the morning, we when we meet each other, we try to discuss what are the new points that have come up, whatever new trials we have read the other day, and what are the new findings which are there across the globe, and we discuss those things. We sit together, and that includes our nursing personnel, our technicians, our junior doctors, and that way we try to keep them motivated by reading stuff and by letting them know what's new in the field, and so that they can beat the fear.
Dr. Anand, how do you protect and keep your team motivated?
See, what we do and what we should do is educate, educate, and educate.
Absolutely.
See, if your staff is educated, they know what actually the disease is, and we teach them the positive trial. See that in Singapore and Hong Kong, what they did, their mask etiquette and their hand hygiene actually prevented 95% of the infections. So I most of the time I generally go and tell the staff that it's what you are doing regularly in your ICU, you need to do it more stringently. That's it. If you are going to follow these things very stringently, you are not going to catch an infection. Generally, we generally do some sessions with the staff. These star sessions have been increased. We are doing Zoom meetings with our team as well, because we have divided our team into two parts, so that if one team is taking care at one point of time, the next team is sitting at home and doing the classes and teaching and educating each and everything through the various platforms which are now are available right now. And so that if there is something advert happen to that team, the other team will take over. Presently we are being blessed that we don't have so many COVID patients in our ICUs, so that we can actually practice that. And that's how we are actually motivating our staff as well.
Thank you.
Right.
Dr. Ansari, I think you have had the experience of handling COVID patients, and your staff has been dealing with COVID patients, right? So how do you emotionally, they become fatigued, they become challenged, they have this fear, right? How do you deal with all that?
So I think one very important thing, Gaurav, as both Saurabh and Sautik has pointed out, that it is about engaging all your people together. Even if they are on battle or off the battle, you need to engage them. I'll just go back one step behind when Sautik was telling that actually you need to have a banding. So we have a clear-cut banding, which is very important, that every physician, healthcare worker who will be going out of the hospital premises and coming back will have a universal screening, as well as a banding whether he is green or red. If he is not fit, he is not feeling well, his traveling has been from any containment zone, not looking good, you just send them out. Or kind of ask them to, kind of get themselves self-tested or self-monitored. So that's one important thing of, kind of separating out. You know that every day there is a universal screening which is there, and there is a process by which you are given a kind of clearance to enter the zone. Number one. Number two, as Saurabh and Sautik said, education is the key. Keep on updating whatever you have learned and assimilating together. As far as motivational part, I think that this is where the team leader needs to have some kind of a mentorship. You need to handhold those people who are in the middle of the oven. And let me put it this way: it has been last 1 month that we have been running a completely COVID institution, and by all humble means, I think we have 60 patients of COVID positive right now in our COVID unit, with nearly 19 critically ill patients out of 20 beds that we have. We have nearly 4 patients who are on dialysis at this point of time. We have done every procedure, including CRRT on them, mechanically ventilating them, proning them, and we have been lucky enough to get a few discharges also. So in various stages, we have all the patients. And what I realized is you cannot depend upon your most junior person to kind of work there. You really need to motivate a few senior staffs who can round themselves, go there for 7 days in, and then kind of rest out for 7 days. And this is very important. You need to roster your senior people and junior people together. Make a small community of those fighters. It's just like Spartans. All those 3 or 4 people who are inside, they should protect each other. You need to talk to them. And I think very important is to have e-roundings. This is very important. And we don't have a dedicated EICU, but we have learned how to get the information percolate from inside to out. And somebody who is not in the middle of the fight is sitting out and more logically looking at things. Sometimes when you are battling inside, you need a coach outside. So I've been, kind of mentoring and coaching them, talking to them, hearing them, and sometimes small things about giving them a variety in their food, their rest timing, where they go and sleep, and whether they are getting some music or some kind of recreational activity in those off times are very important.
Thank you, sir. If I have to just summarize whatever points I've taken from till now is that universal precautions have to be followed, whether it is COVID, non-COVID. You have to do hand hygiene, protect yourself through a mask. You need to lead by example, right? The best of the resources need to be put into the toughest of the task. If they practice hand hygiene and masking, 95% of them will never get infected. And even with the young force which we have, they get infected, there is again a 90% chance that then nothing is going to happen to them. And education, awareness, empowering, and most importantly, the team spirit at this time. So the questions which my teams ask me, sir, हम hospital से patient ले रहे हैं, COVID तो नहीं होगा. I think you have answered it very well that COVID and non-COVID are very clearly segregated. And even if it is COVID, things don't change for us, right? So coming back to now, my next question is again to Dr. Ansari now. So Ansari sir, you have had now such a rich experience of managing these patients. When do you decide that a patient can be discharged, or what is the discharge criteria of a COVID positive patient?
As we all have been talking that we need to have a hospital in a hospital. So I have various step up and step down ways in which a patient can move. So any patient who is suspect COVID or a proven COVID, depending upon the severity or acuity of illness, go patient which is a monitored care bed or into an intensive care or a simple ward area. So if he is moving into one of these areas in a step down pattern, that means he was sick enough, needed very high flow oxygen, then his acute lung injury or ARDS kind of got better. He's breathing much better, only 1 or 2 liters of oxygen, breath hold time is good, he is afebrile, his numbers are looking good. He moves out to the ward zone. And after 5 days of having been in a hospital from the last swab, and if you feel he's symptomatically better, we do is repeat swabbing. At this point of time, if his swab comes positive, he needs to be monitored. The treatment continues, and we are doing a small case series of finding out if on the 5th day you are COVID swab positive, you add another drug like ivermectin or think about tocilizumab or something else, depending upon the clinical scenario. If he is negative after the 5 days, that means he is optimally responding. You wait for another 24 hours and do a repeat swab. Look at him clinically improving on all accounts. And if he has become asymptomatic now, with 2 negative swabs, there was initially a stringent criteria of 8 days of a hospital stay, that's no more longer applicable. Even after 5 days, your 1 swab has come negative and another swab 24 hours apart has come negative. You are good to get him a discharge and continue monitoring him at home for 14 days in total. So that's a reasonably good discharge criteria. If you have a person who is mildly symptomatic and has turned negative, you may move him to a monitored care setting or a general setting. And those people who are completely asymptomatic to start with were in the hospital just because they were COVID positive, they probably can be safely discharged after 1 swab negative as per the recent MCGM guidelines. I would want Saurabh and Sautik to pitch in at this point.
Please.
We are actually following the same criteria, Dr. Ansari. It's the same criteria which we are following, sir.
Dr. Panda, you want to add?
Dr. Panda, you have to unmute yourself.
You're on mute.
Once the signs and symptoms have subsided, we are waiting for 3 more days, 72 hours. After that, we are sending the first swab sample. And we are repeating the next sample after 24 hours. And once 2 samples are negative, we are deciding to shift him out of the red zone.
So I think fairly
common. The crux of the matter is that if the patient has turned out to be positive, then 2 samples should be negative before sending him to a discharge, as most of the viewers have been asking. But if the patient was a suspected COVID, then if you have a negative report, 1 negative report is also suffice unless and until you strongly suspect that the patient should be a COVID patient, then you might send a second swab 24 hours after that.
Great, sir. And what do you think at home can be the recurrence rate? Once you have 2 swabs negative and this patient is being monitored for 14 days, what are the chances that there could be a recurrence in this patient?
See, there are many reports.
Yes, this is something very, very tricky because the shedding of the virus has been found in this stool for 30 days. And there are some reports that virus shedding has been found till day 37 after the negative report. So this is a very tricky
What do we
question.
say?
We still don't know. We still don't
Yeah,
know.
I
That's why
agree.
the virus is novel.
NEGM has become so reasonable that they are now publishing with 5 patient data also and everything. So I think 260 paper publications have happened over the last 2 months, right? Crazy. But what is a practical? What is your practical experience, Dr. Ansari? How many patients whom you have discharged have deteriorated, or there was a hint that these patients could get again positive?
So luckily, more than 10 discharges for us have taken place, and we haven't seen any kind of a problem with them. In fact, we are thinking about getting convalescent plasma also from them. More than 14 days of discharge. So that's something which we are talking about. In fact, I could see on the ticker there was a question about, are these therapies working? So I think there are two parts to it. One, most of the patients, if they don't die of the acute illness or that hyperinflammatory syndrome or their comorbidities, they will come out. They will have a individual way in which they will develop their antibodies. They may continue with viral shedding. So all the precautions for the handlers, healthcare workers will remain applicable, I think, till the patient doesn't need any healthcare worker. So if you say that a person with a tracheostomy with COVID-19 recent infection has gone home, I don't think you can doff out your PPE very easily on that gentleman. So it's very simple that you need to be very vigilant. The way we were suspecting everybody walking in as COVID positive, you have to keep on looking at a possibility of even third swab coming positive after having two in between negative. So I
Right.
think a very important universal precaution, and the barrier nursings and taking care of your hand hygiene would be very important.
That's why I said, sir, irrespective whether a patient is COVID or not COVID, we have to practice is as stringently as Dr. Anand said कि ये कोई नया नहीं है, ये हम पहले भी करते थे, अब हमने बोला है थोड़ा और stringently करो. So these precautions had to be followed. Yeah, Dr. Anand, you were saying something.
See, the most of the people are worried about whether this patient is going to infect us or not after the patient has come out to be negative. See, one thing we need to clearly know in every viral diseases, the amount of shedding is generally being proportional to the disease severity. Okay, so even when the disease severity has been decreased, the viral shedding has been decreased. That's for sure. So even if he is shedding at that time, the chances of getting another person infected, and that to a severe extent, unless and until he is a patient with severe comorbidities and something like that, on a age group which is more than 60 or something like that, the chances of having a reinfection or having an infection from that person is very low, and that is out of the standard deviation, the Bell's curves we generally read out. So most of the time it is secure when you have two negative samples obtained or less than 24 hours apart. We have discussed about the discharge criteria already.
I'll repeat what Dr. Anand said, that once you have had 2 samples, the viral shedding, which is very proportional to the severity, and as the severity is decreased, so the viral shedding also decreases, and the young population of our employees, which goes again, although the immunity levels are high, the chances of getting infected for our people are less, but maybe for an elderly person at home is more. So it is a duty for our people also that whenever we are treating patients, we have to segregate the young individuals from the older individuals at home. And once we start taking COVID positive patients, we'll have protocols around isolation at home also, which we'll practice, and barrier nursing definitely, which we have been talking. So my next question to all three, and anybody can take it. There are questions around chloroquine prophylaxis. So how good, how bad? Because I know there are a lot of side effects also, hypoglycemia, heart attacks, and gastritis and all. So shouldn't everybody be given chloroquine, or when should we give prophylactic chloroquine? Dr. Anand, if you want to take it.
See, when the ICMR guidelines come in, before the guidelines chip in, the HCQ was actually been disappeared from the market.
Right.
So our public and Google is more faster than anything else. Okay, but yes, the prophylaxis, we are following the ICMR guidelines, and we are giving prophylaxis to those people who are actually working in the COVID ICU. All the staff is being receiving the HCQ prophylaxis, 400 milligram BD on the very first day, and then for 7 weeks later on. But yes, if you ask me that there is a concrete evidence behind it, no. In the treatment also, HCQ and azithral has been used in India. If you ask me that whether there is a strong evidence with it, no, I don't have an answer for that as well. Many things are going on right now in the world, and I think we are going to see some ray of hope in coming in weeks to go.
Right, Dr. Ansari, you want to add to it? Treatment, prophylaxis.
Yeah, I think there is an old adage that you keep the organs alive till they can recover. So I think the whole idea is to give aggressive supportive therapy. You may or may not need HCQ, but you definitely need airway, breathing, circulatory support. Now there were two more good questions which popped up. One was about the COVID-related myocarditis. I think that is a very important aspect which is very neglected. We are doing for every patient who gets admitted a troponin level at the beginning, along with the other cardiac markers, and a routine echo or at least a lung ultrasound. If you have a trained intensivist inside who is capable of doing a point of care ultrasound, there is nothing better than that. Any person who is presenting with a poor LV function is highly likely of developing arrhythmias, which could be lethal arrhythmias, and it's very important to keep a close watch. And probably you need to be very paranoid about the QTC there, because there are reports of QTC prolongation of more than 60 milliseconds in a day, and that kind of amounting to major arrhythmias, torsades. So I think that has to be kept in mind, especially when you are using HCQ and SE and there may be any renal dysfunction or elderly population. Lastly, there is cautious but a definite use of tocilizumab as one of the anti-inflammatory therapy. Can benefit, I am not very sure. We have used it on a couple of patients. I can't say whether they are helping or no, because it's out of the ambit of a randomized controlled trial. I may have a lot of bias on that. Lastly, convalescent plasma, I think we still have to see with a period of time whether it really helps. Because my worry is giving convalescent plasma would be benefiting only in the first 4 to 5 days when the viral multiplication is very high. Once your organ damage has taken place and viral replication has come down, giving convalescent plasma or antibody may probably not help you recover from the organ dysfunction which is already set in.
See,
So I think every disease phase will have its own intervention.
sir,
Yeah.
right now, I think remdesivir is the only drug which is showing promise right now in the world. So I will say that 2 phase 3 trials actually with initial reports are actually favoring and decreasing the mortality in those patients. I yesterday have read and gone through all those trials. So that is the only drug which is right now not available in India, but might be the only ray of hope which I am seeing. Plasma and might help.
Yeah, my friends in USA have also been talking a lot about this drug. But one of my friends who's a nephrologist said that respiratory aside, renal failure is one of the presenting symptoms with all such patients. So, and it has been the second most common presenting feature. So, Dr. Ansari, any views on this?
So our own cohort of patients, we feel there is a 12 to 15% incidence of renal dysfunction.
Yes.
Now, if you have a concomitant chronic kidney disease, the incidence of AKI is very high. But de novo acute kidney injury, just because of either dehydration, volume depletion, or the toxic effect, is significant. We have 2 young people who have no business of having a creatinine dysfunction. They presented with that. They usually resolve with fluid optimization. So that's one good thing. If you don't have an associated LV dysfunction, the kidney functions usually are soft renal failure, I would say this way. But if you are associated with ARDS, fluid overload, metabolic dysfunction, you don't have time to wait. You have to start early renal replacement therapy, and preferably CRRT would be the way of choice, way of renal support.
2 last questions before we wind up, because it's already 7:43. Dr. Ansari, that if a patient has gone into SARI or maybe less than SARI or had a respiratory involvement, what is the chances of residual disability in these people? Any views on that? That somebody who's got cured was left with a lung scar or a reduced tidal volume or something? Any views, any one of you on this?
Whatever prediction we will have will be extrapolation from the MERS and the SARS illnesses in the past. As of now, I think nobody has an answer to that, unless we talk to the Chinese people who can talk about their data, which are talking about some form of fibrocavitatory lesions happening there. Because if you look at the nature of the CT scan, it is an interstitial disease to start with. There are sublobar consolidations. So you will have the same sequelae of ARDS. But there is definitely Italian investigators talking about two types of lung dysfunction, that is L type and H type. So I think if you are onto an H type, you may have more residual dysfunction because of a poor compliance, need for respiratory support for long duration, or ECMO or high PEEP. In this situation, I personally feel it's too early for us to comment upon long-term impact, but naturally, 5 to 10% of survivors will have long-term disabilities, even though they may be even though they may have no premorbid illnesses to start with.
Well,
So if I have to just put it rightly, 90% of the people are asymptomatic, right? 10% or rather 5% will go into swear. And you were saying that out of those 5% who swear, maybe 5% have a residual disability. That's how I should take it. Asymptomatic people, any chances of getting into residual disability? As of now, I don't see any indications, right?
Yeah, asymptomatic by definition has no respiratory kind of manifestation.
Right.
Symptomatic individual not needing ventilatory support may still have some kind of chronic respiratory ailment. It is early to say, because we see that a lot of time post-viral bronchitis is known, and it can last for 3 to 4 weeks and sometimes longer. But at the end of 1 year, most of the ARDS sequelae have resolved well with some amount of respiratory impairment, which is seen on PFT. So I think only time will tell. But if you don't have any bad respiratory involvement, unlikely to say that there would be residual problem.
Gaurav, end of the day, it's a viral pneumonia. The name might be SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. End of the day, it's a viral pneumonia, and by all perception, it's going to behave like one.
Yes. At the end of the hat of sardi khansi zukam, sir. Right. So at the end, one more question which has popped up is the role of physiotherapy in managing COVID patients in hospital at home. Any one of you wants to take it? Respiratory physiotherapy. Are you using it in your patients, Dr. Ansari?
No, honestly speaking, at this point of time, we know that the biggest logistic problem is you can't allow more people inside.
Right.
So, and doing physical therapy is actually also aerosol generating. So to do that is not helpful unless you have mucus plugging, where you need to do something by positional therapy, which the nurses and the intensivists may be able to do at the point of care. But I don't think we should be doing it unless there are COVID negative sampling which has happened. And the patient is in a recovery mode and disability rehabilitation can take place as the patients are moving out of intensive care.
See, Gaurav, lot of data has come for a silent hypoxemia, actually. Okay. And most of these patients have been on a silent. If you put a pulse oximeter probe on these patients, the SpO2 might be showing 88, 89, 90, but the patient might be symptomatically pretty okay, talking to you, eating well, and everything is like that. So awake proning has been coming to rescue in, so you are getting a data from huge data from Spain, France, UK. They are right now doing awake proning before. See, in the initial phase, we have been told to intubate early. But right now, what we are doing, what we are practicing right now is waiting and then going to a non-invasive ventilation and then going for intubation. So the things has been changing definitely. When the data from the China has come, now the data from the Europe has come, we are analyzing, and actually the treatment is drifting.
Dr. Panda, what is your message for our employees who have been holding the fort for last 1 month now? I must congratulate all my people. We have been giving uninterrupted services at home. Patients where in Bombay, hospitals became clusters. We got again non-COVID patients at home. And the team has been really working overtime to get people at home in this lockdown, including all equipments, consumables, and emergency things. So what is your message for our team, Dr. Panda?
First of all, I would like to say kudos to your entire team for that, because in this period, this challenging period of lockdown, you are providing such high quality service at home. So this is really, really appreciable. And secondly, see, this hand washing and using of masks is going to stay with us now for a very long, long time. So your soldiers have to follow this rule while they are working there in the field or at home, anywhere, and that is it. And you're already keeping their morale up.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. Message from you.
See, the same message. I will say that follow your mask etiquettes and hand hygiene stringently. That's my ultimate message to them. And don't fall into the traps. Read well, read from good journals, have a word with your doctors who are going to tell you the truth. Don't follow into any of the traps which has been laid down from X and Y people, and keep your moral high. Whenever they are off duty, they should be engaging with other people, maybe on an online basis. This is the only way we can engage with people right now. So that's how we are doing, educate themselves.
Dr. Ansari.
Gaurav, I must say that they are the most strongest of the healthcare workers because they need to work in difficult trying times, and they are not having the institutional cover on their heads. So they are actually people who have to know everything about or something about everything, and those something should be the relevant something about them. They must know how to do universal precautions. They must take care of themselves. They must know that they are distancing from the patient is also important at the right time.
Right.
Only when they are doing a procedure and when they are donning their personal protective equipments, how to do that. And the most important single liner, which I feel is the biggest chink in the armor, is they keep on manipulating their masks. Never do that. I think if a single intervention which can change the whole outcome is keep your hands away from your face when you're working. Once you have donned your mask, then you're not going to touch it, and that can take your chances of contaminating your face by more than 50 to 70%. I think that
Thank
is
you, sir.
wonderful.
Thank you so much for all three of you for your time. I think the team has really gained by it. If I have to just collate, everybody said be motivated, lead by example, keep practicing hand hygiene. As sir said, do not touch your face, do not touch your mask, universal precautions, and stringent criteria for onboarding the patients. And everybody is under suspicion, but at the same time young population which we are catering to, or the young population which is employed by us, has very less chances of getting symptomatic or getting into severity. Thank you so much, Dr. Ansari, Dr. Anand, and
Thank
Dr.
you.
Panda, for
Thank you.
joining us here.
Thank
And
you.
there were, I would must tell you, we reached out to 7,000 people on Facebook at any given point of time. We had around 70 people on Zoom and around 70 people on FB throughout the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, sir. Bye.